Welcome to another episode of the Reedman Report, where we talk about security, risk, technology, and education. At the intersection of those is if you actually hear this episode or not. And because the algorithm is constantly changing, this will be a much shorter conversation than some of my prior ones. And one of my prior conversations was with my same guest today. At the time, Dr. Dan Hamlin was a professor at University of Oklahoma.
Yes,
he was a professor there. But now he has a different job. He is the Secretary of Education for the state of Oklahoma. So not only an academic, but somebody who is putting policy into practice. Dan, thanks so much for coming back on the show. So we're having this conversation not about your new job, but I will ask you a couple questions about that. We finally had a paper that we wrote about 2 years ago, published last week. It's called Stopping Violence Before It Starts, an analysis of how potential school gun attacks are exposed. This was a novel study looking at the pathways to prevention rather than the actual kind of details of the plots. How did we first come up with this topic? I'm trying to remember because it's been so long.
Well, I think we had some discussions about school security, whether or not a lot of the measures that schools have invested in actually stop school gun violence from happening. So, as you know, schools now spend billions of dollars on all types of security, whether it's a school resource officer, whether it's cameras, various types of technologies. There's just so much out there now that schools are spending on different types of apps, alert programs, all kinds of software. And I think where we landed was if you look at the research on all of these different measures that schools are investing in, it's not really clear whether it actually stops school gun violence or not. So we don't, and what I mean by it's not really clear is I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but we actually are not really sure if it actually works. And that's partly because it's really hard to design a credible study where you could test where something worked to stop school gun violence. Part of the problem is, and this is fortunate, school gun violence is so rare that statistically it's hard to do that kind of analysis. But if you were going to do some kind of a randomized controlled trial that would potentially generate credible causal estimates of a security measure, well, you could randomly assign metal detectors or randomly assign certain types of cameras, but still you have the same problem of if gun violence doesn't happen, and it's very unlikely to happen, you really aren't able to test much of anything. So from a causal standpoint, we just don't know. And so I think what we had started discussing was, well, how could we get closer to trying to understand this? And David, you had started putting together a data set of cases where school gun violence or potential school gun violence was exposed both on school grounds and off school grounds. And, I think in our conversations together, we thought, well, this might be a really good analysis where we could understand in those cases what's emerging. Is it the school resource officer that's standing out and really stopping gun violence before it happens? Is it metal detectors? Is it your school-based threat assessment team that's stepping in and stopping these attacks from happening? So we put together, you had got going and put together this data set, and then myself and Sam Nab, who's a doctoral student at the University of Oklahoma, we also found some additional cases over, I believe it was a 5 or 6 year period. And we were able to put together this data set to try to take a deep dive into these different cases that were exposed before they potentially could happen.
Yeah, my Google Drive is a mess of kind of half-baked data collection projects because I see all of this information that doesn't fit the criteria for the K through 12 school shooting database, but seems important. And one of those data sets that I've published on was just threats of shootings, all kinds, Instagram posts, memes, jokes, writing on the bathroom wall. Most of them were not connected to actual threats of violence. That's about 2,000 of those threats and a coded analysis of them went into a prior paper that I wrote. But within those threats, I had a separate spreadsheet, which was like the actual plots that didn't happen. This was somebody had intent, had some sort of detailed planning. They might have written a manifesto or had a hit list or had a map of the school. And then they were also making attempts to either get guns, get ammunition. So these were plots that were very close to happening, but didn't. And that's where the discussions that I had with you and Sam ultimately came up to, let's code and figure out who stopped them, how they were stopped, and then let's group those into some different pathways. We kind of came up with different scenarios for how a shooting was stopped. And I think that was a novel finding we haven't seen anywhere before.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the way I would characterize the cases is we can't say for sure that these were incidents that would have otherwise happened had they not been stopped in some way. You can't really know that counterfactual. But I think you're right to say that we collected evidence to say, was the capability at least there? So for example, in 56% of the cases that we looked at, there was some kind of the potential assailant had access to a gun or even a gun stockpile. So that's over half of those cases. So the capability was there. I think in 43% of all the cases, there was the assailant had a hit list or some kind of documented plans to carry out the attack. So many of the incidents we looked at, while we can't know for sure that they would have happened had someone not stepped in to address them, it sure looked like a lot of them had pretty serious capabilities.
Yeah, that's where it's difficult figuring out what's just a threat or a bad joke from what's a valid plot that's being disrupted. And there's no consensus about that. But we kind of explained the way to differentiate between maybe just a passing statement and really no planning or capability from, these 125 cases. From those cases, once we analyzed them and did thematic coding and also did some quantitative coding, we found that there were these four main recurring scenarios in the ways that plots were averted. Either there was public signaling, that meant that the person who was committing the plot was either telling others about it or posting online. There was private disclosure, which was different from the public signaling because it was speaking to somebody kind of in the confidence that they were going to keep it private, maybe a friend or a coworker or a family member. Our third case was a discovery of plans. So somebody was trying to plan in secret, but somebody found their journal or found various materials that they'd written online. And then the last, which is the one that gets a lot of funding and a lot of attention, is the detection through a formal system. And that would be a police investigation, a formal FBI investigation, or something that went through a kind of state-sponsored or school-sponsored reporting app.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary of the different types of cases. So again, what we tried to do was collect some general descriptive statistics that would help us to understand how these potential attacks come to light. But then we also dug into the cases a little bit more deeply to really look at, well, what were some of the details? What were some of the interacting features to try to really flesh it out a little bit more? Because, the cases are often complex, but I do think we saw some interesting trends that I would highlight for your listeners, David. So the first thing that really stood out to my mind is that in 42% of all the incidents we looked at, it was actually students themselves who unearthed and brought the case to light. So the school resource officer or the threat assessment team or other teachers or other parents may not have known about the potential attack, but it was the students overhearing something in class, overhearing something in the bathrooms, being told directly by the assailant, hey, I'm going to carry out this attack. And then the students bringing forward the attack to the authorities or a teacher or a principal and then those individuals taking action to see what was going on. So I thought that, to my mind, that was an enormously important finding because, okay, we're spending quite a bit of money and investing quite a bit of money in hard measures of school security or investing in threat assessment teams. And if you think, well, roughly half of all of these cases are coming to light just from students themselves, well, whether or not you're going to have these different measures in place, you'd have to think as a school leader, as a teacher, as district personnel, that you'd want to have some approaches in place that would encourage students to report attacks or report something that they've heard, so that you could then unearth these potential cases. And so, that might mean, how do you cultivate positive relationships between students and teachers and administrators in the school? How do you cultivate a culture that says, if you hear about something like this, please do report it. Don't stand by as a bystander and let this go, because that's what we've seen in a lot of the cases that did actually happen previously. There were students who knew what was going on. They saw the public signaling online, where you see copycat behavior, people trying to pretend like they're the Columbine shooters by the way that they dress or talk, or students who heard things in the bathroom or heard things in class, and then it goes unreported, and then lo and behold, the attack happened. So cultivating these relationships, cultivating a culture that says, if you hear something like this, you need to report it. And then developing, I think, overall, is developing that culture of trust in the school community. And it just seemed like, yes, again, you could have a lot of these measures in place, but they may not be they may actually be kind of ineffective if you don't have this other piece, because you've got this whole group of people, in this case, the students, who are seemingly most likely to be able to unearth these events.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that we coded is whether the plot was stopped on school grounds or off of school grounds. And if something is being stopped on school grounds, that's kind of the last ditch effort, where, if you miss something, there might potentially be violence. You have a very small margin for error there. And I think what was interesting in those findings is that students that had guns, stockpiles of guns or ammunition, those were the cases that were most often stopped on school grounds. And if you have a metal detector or security guards or something, there's something visible and physical for them to find there. But we found the majority of the plots, where many of these were really serious situations, when there were things like hit lists and manifestos and observable behavior, most of those plots were stopped off of school grounds. So you're taking an even more proactive measure. You're creating an even larger safety net, where if you miss something, you have more opportunities if you trust students and trust community members to report that they've seen this manifesto, to report that they've seen these social media posts. So having that community engagement, where people know what to look for and then know how to take action when they see a problem, that really extends the ability to prevent violence before it's imminent.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. But what I would actually reiterate, though, is even those cases that were stopped on school grounds, where you'd expect, maybe it is the technology or the security apparatus that's playing a much, more important role when things are happening in real time at school. Even in those cases, 50% of the time it was actually students who were involved in bringing them to light. So, I also thought that was interesting, because that was unexpected for me. I thought surely it's the security apparatus, when it's happening on school grounds, that's going to be solely involved with this. And we did find that there were some cases where school resource officers or police or teachers or administrators were involved in a few cases. There were searches and seizures that ended up bringing or played a role in bringing potential attacks to light. But again, students, half the time playing a really significant role.
Yeah, and since we wrote this paper, I did another data collection project where I just looked at all of the news alerts that I had for students arrested with guns at schools during the This was a 24-25 school year. So I had a little more than 1,000 cases. That wasn't really a true random sample. That would be a tough one to kind of write an academic paper on, but it still had some pretty interesting findings. And in that, more than 80% of the arrests where a student has a gun on school property came from a tip from a classmate. Very few were the entry screening. Very few were random screenings. It was either a tip from a classmate, or in many cases, students posted either something they said they had a gun or photos of themselves with a gun on social media. And then from there, they were able to determine that there was a gun in the school. So I think we're starting to amass more and more kind of data from different angles that all points in the same direction, that it's empowering students and community members to say something is really the most effective and the lowest cost way to prevent gun violence.
Yeah, it doesn't cost much of anything. I don't know that you need a week of professional development on it, but it could be something that is easily incorporated into existing school climate strategies, professional development for teachers at different points throughout the year. But again, I don't think it needs to be something where you need a huge investment or an incredible amount of time spent on it, but just being a little bit more deliberate about how you approach that. So I think that's right. And I don't think either of us are saying here that school security doesn't work, or, hey, don't invest in school security. I think what we're saying is we just don't know. We're making these massive investments and we're not really sure. We just can't know the counterfactual. But at the same time, we're seeing the evidence that we are seeing suggests that there's this really important human element here. And I think that's what our work is helping to amplify.
Now, in your current role as the Secretary of Education for the state of Oklahoma, are there any of the findings from this paper or the other academic research around violence prevention that you're taking from, academic work and translating it into real public policy in the state of Oklahoma?
Yeah, well, I do have opportunities to speak with lots of our teachers and district leaders and principals around the state. And when I do that, I'll often take questions. Invariably, school safety and school security concerns will come up. I'll get lots of questions about that. And actually, I've had an opportunity to discuss the results of our paper many times with our educators in schools. And what I always find interesting when I'm discussing the results and highlighting this human element and this relational component of school safety, I just start seeing heads nodding all across the audience, and it just seems to resonate really well with people. I found that to be encouraging, because I think if you're, as a researcher, if you're generating results that aren't resonating with people, that may lead you to have to dig a little deeper and find out what may be really going on. But it just gives you another piece of evidence that says, okay, maybe there is something here. Beyond just, we've got the data, but at least people who are on the ground, they're also, identifying with what you're finding. And that does seem to be important.
Yeah, our conclusion from this paper was that these pathways to exposing a threat suggest that positive relationships in schools, open lines of communication, and high expectations of reporting serious threats may be central to averting school gun attacks. I think none of those really have a cost associated with them. But I think our most interesting one is that creating those high expectations of reporting threats, that you're turning the students and the community members into a proactive group. Is there anything tangible that you're pushing forward in Oklahoma that you think a school could do to create that high expectation of vigilance?
Well, from a policy standpoint, I don't know that we have put forth any legislation or any bill that would do that. But again, I think where I'm trying to emphasize this is in my discussions with district leaders and educators, to emphasize the importance of integrating that approach into school climate and the culture in the school community. I think that's potentially the best way to go about doing it, that spreading the information, spreading the findings that we have, and making folks aware of that, I think is maybe most important. I don't know. I mean, I don't know it's something that you'd even want to legislate, to be honest with you, because I think each district is going to have its own unique idiosyncratic features and may need to take different approaches to this. So some of our rural districts where hunting, for example, some of our rural districts in Oklahoma, where hunting season is really important, may take an entirely different tact to this than maybe some of our urban or suburban school districts. So, all that's to say, I don't know that this is something that is necessarily great to legislate, but it's something I think to bring awareness to and to really encourage districts to come up with strategies for responding in this way. Because I think it could, what high expectations means for reporting, just the way that that unfolds could look a little different depending on the district.
When your time in public service comes to an end and you return back to University of Oklahoma to continue teaching and research, what's the biggest unanswered question that you have from this study? And is there anything, this came out of a previous paper that you wrote and we discussed about the difference in different types of gun violence on school property. We then dug into the averted attacks. Is there anything that you want to research next?
Well, I remain interested in trying to understand what actually could be done from a school-based perspective. What, given our investments in different types of security measures, how can we design some studies that would start to shed a little bit more light on this? I do think that there's a promising line of research on alert systems or anonymous, or especially anonymous reporting systems that seem to suggest there may be something there. But I'd like to look a little bit further into that and really try to continue to think about, how can we design some studies that would help us to better understand, is this investment actually worth it or not? So that remains, a tough question to answer, but I think one I'm going to continue to pursue. Hopefully with you, maybe we can work on an additional study here in the near future.
Always happy to, because in academia, you write and write, you submit, you get some rejections, you get some acceptances, you get many rounds of peer review that can often take months and months or even years in this case. But in the end, you've got some powerful findings that you can get out, and hopefully they make a difference. So our paper is Stopping Gun Violence Before It Starts. There's a link to the paper in the show notes. There's also a link to a plain language summary that I wrote of the findings. And I'll also add a link to the discussion that Dan and I had last year about the differences in types of gun violence on school property. So Dan, I will let you get back to your work as Secretary of Education, and thank you for your time today.